Greeting YouTube. As frequent viewers of my channel will know, I do a lot of reviews of role-playing games and discussions of role-playing games. I read a lot of role-playing game books. I do it as entertainment, something I enjoy. I enjoy the meta-fiction aspect of the hobby. I can read a book and I can spend hours creating characters and storylines in my head, all based off the rules. Or at least if the rules might get me thinking. If the rules don't get me thinking, those are bad rules. And one of the things I've noticed over time is that some games seem to get book layout right and some games don't. Now, if we're talking a system that uses the class race concept, I like to have right off the bat your races up front, first chapter, and then class descriptions, and then somewhere either involved in that process or in a third chapter which deals with a walkthrough on the actual character creation process. I love when games give lots of examples using specific characters, saying Bob the Ranger, and then explaining why Bob the Ranger is making certain choices for his character. And I find that very helpful, especially if it's a set of rules that I've never read before, or one that's diverging from a set of rules that I have read. For example, the D20 OGL rules are an entire category of rules. You know, it's a whole bunch of things all under that one heading. So if something's going to diverge a little, I want to have an example so I know what they're talking about. Now, it's a system that doesn't use classes, for example, the Mutant Epoch. It starts off right from the get-go with character development, random charts for knowing what your race is, or what your background is, what skill set you have, things like that. And then it goes into specifics of the race themselves, the race options you have themselves, and all the details that you need. And that is also a good format. Now, I have encountered games that start off right from the bat giving me history, lots of background history. And I think the idea is that they want me to become immersed in the world from a fluff standpoint. They want me to really surround myself in the atmosphere of the game before I get into the mechanics of race, class, or character development if it isn't the race, class, design kind of system. Now, for me, though, to get into that world, I have to understand how I, the character, fit into it. Excuse me. And I can't do that unless I know what kind of career paths my character is going to have, what classes, or the class design, say if it isn't, you know, if you're not using a class-based system, if it's just skill sets or things like that, and the races they have as options. I need to be able to project myself into a character so that then I can relate to the world they are presenting to me. That's just the way I think. And I've read some games that, I read one recently, which I'm not going to review because it was so bad and the name of the game even escapes me at the moment, that didn't get to the actual races. It was like 114 pages into the book. I mean, that's a little late for races to be shown up. You've already covered almost the entire game before I get to that section. It wasn't, the book was only 160 or 80 pages long. So that was a bad layout. I want to have that information much closer to the front. Now, if you want to give me a little blurb, fine. Some games like to use in-game fiction. I have very rarely ever read in-game fiction. I find it dull. There have been times when I have found it interesting. The in-game fiction that was done in the OGL Steampunk book was excellent, but it was also broken up into small, digestible pieces. Instead of presenting me with 6 or 8 pages of one unbroken story, it presented me with like a sidebar. And then 4 or 5 pages later, there might be another sidebar. So over the course of the book, and each section was pertinent to the chapter that we were in, I got the entire story. It was very well handled, and I applaud the authors for having done it that way. And that kind of thing helps it along. It's that whole concept of kind of taking you by the hand and showing you what's going on in the game. And again, I want to understand character development from an insider's view, not just from me looking at the rules and hoping I can figure out what they're talking about. Now, the other thing I've noticed is that for some reason, lots of people like to rename the role of the game master. Now, we're reading a game. It's a tabletop role-playing game. The person in charge of that game is the master of ceremonies. They are the game master. That's a perfectly legitimate term to use in reference to the person that's running the game. And I am not a fan of games that don't have game masters. I freely admit that probably makes me old school in that regard. And I apologize for anyone out there who really loves the narrative games like Forsooth and things like that that don't have GMs. Game on, folks. Just isn't my bag. But I've seen many games. I looked at one yesterday, Agon, I believe it was pronounced. And they call them the Eminence Grise. The last part of the word is Grise, so it's Gris or Grise, I'm not sure which. And that's the title that you're supposed to use as the game master. That's pretentious crap. I would not use that term. And if someone at the table referred to me in that manner, I'd probably laugh at them. That's just silly in my book. Game Master's more pragmatic. It gets to the core of what's going on. Or, you can call me James. That works as well. I've seen lots of games that do this. And I've never understood the reasoning. Why is an author thinking that if they rename the Game Master, suddenly there's going to be some kind of epiphany that I'm going to suddenly realize I'm not in D&D. I have a whole new range of options. I have been transported into this new game. That's not what happens. I just find it jarring and off-putting. Because now I'm being asked to handle a term that I find awkward and keeps making me think that they're not talking about the guy in charge of the game. Yes, that may make me a bit of a Luddite, and I apologize. So, I want to ask my viewers, particularly those in the RPG YouTube brigade, I don't imagine that many people who aren't in that are watching this video, what are some things that you like about role-playing game layout and things that you don't like about role-playing game layouts? And do you have a care at all about what the person in charge of the game is called? Do you prefer the Dungeon Master when you run D&D? Or is Game Master, which I use, a generic term that you use regardless of the system? I've used that term in superheroes and science fiction and science fantasy, and I've never had a problem with any of it. But I want to know, does the name of that position, the person in charge of the game, have an impact in your mind on how they do their job?